Okay. Very brief introduction. Edith Simon is a research scientist in the Center for Human Sleep Science at UC Berkeley, conducting research on the neuroscience of sleep. I don't remember who pointed me to your research, but I remember going to your website and I started reading, and it's a fascinating stuff, really. Okay. And again, longer bios, you can find the full bio and a link to our website at lasertalks.com.
I want to talk to you about the work we've been doing looking at the effects of sleep and lack of sleep on emotional processing. I loved, Amy, that you talked a lot about emotions. I think it's the basic infrastructure of our experience, and I'm really interested in how sleep affects that. Unfortunately, we live in increasingly sleepless societies. If we look at sleep duration in the 40s, let me just get this out of the way. So this was a survey done about sleep duration in the US. Oh, you can still see that. Okay, I hope you can see everything. What they saw back then in the 40s is that about half of all individuals. Oh, you can see.
We can see on our screens. We can see well.
Yeah,
it's just your screen. Yes.
There is a 9 or more.
Yeah, we can see.
So what they saw back then is that about half of all individuals were sleeping 8 hours, which is the middle of the recommended 7 to 9 hours range for healthy adults. And only about 11% were getting less than the minimum 7 hours of sleep. So either 6, 5 hours or less. But if we fast forward to the 90s, we see a shift towards shorter sleep. So now the number of people getting the recommended 8 hours of sleep is cut by half. And the number of people getting less than 7 hours is almost triple. And if we fast forward until today, we see pretty much the same numbers. About 30 to 40% of all Americans are not getting the minimum 7 hours of sleep. And we went from an average sleep duration of nearly 8 hours in the 40s to 6.5 today. That's the equivalent of losing a whole sleep cycle, an hour and a half of sleep every single night. And I was really interested when I got into sleep science. What does that do to our brain, to our body, to our behavior, to how we feel? So actually, the National Sleep Foundation has asked a similar question. In 2011, they had a survey with more than 1,000 Americans, and they asked them, what do you feel is affected if you don't get enough sleep? And what people said pretty much covers everything we do every day. Most of them mentioned their mood is affected, 85%. People have also mentioned schoolwork. So this was done in adults ages 16 and up. But also the adult version of work, people mentioned family life, social life, and intimate relations. And when you think about these domains, they do cover a lot of what we do every day. Our work, our interaction with other people, how we feel about the experiences that we have. And we have quite a bit of data showing that sleep does affect every one of these domains. What we are missing right now is an understanding of how. What is the changes that might be happening in the brain or the body that lead sleep to affect each and every one of these domains. So I've been doing some work on emotion, but also on social activity. And I want to talk to you today mostly about one of the most robust impacts of sleep on our lives, which is changes in mood, and specifically anxiety. Anxiety is currently the leading mental disorder worldwide. And we're also seeing increasing rates in younger adults. What you're going to see here is the number of students diagnosed or treated for anxiety disorder in the past decade. And what you can see that these numbers are almost doubled. So these are national statistics across the US. And one of the things we know that college experience has a lot of is lack of sleep. But the causal connections are not still being made. Is it the sleep that might be causing the increase in anxiety? And when we look at people who suffer from trouble sleeping, who have insomnia, we see that, I'm sorry about the wrong thing. We see that if we track them for a year or even longer, they have more than twice, they're more than twice as likely to develop an anxiety disorder down the line. That's anxiety here. And similarly, if we look at people who have anxiety, about 70 to 80% of them would report that they have trouble either falling asleep or staying asleep. So very strong and intimate links between anxiety and lack of sleep. But again, what we don't understand is why. And this is the study that we did, one of the first studies I did when I arrived at Berkeley, trying to understand two basic questions. First, if we take away sleep, what might be happening in the brain or the body that could trigger anxiety? Does lack of sleep trigger anxiety if we just focus on healthy adults? These are the kind of questions we ask first. And then the second one, if we do allow sleep, what is it about sleep that actually blocks this process and helps us stay calm the next day? So I want to tell you about the study that we have done and to answer this question. We had 18 healthy participants, most of them students, and they visited the lab twice. One session, they were allowed to sleep or recorded their brain activity. The second session, they were asked politely to stay awake for the entire night. We paid the students for this, and they usually come in thinking, oh, this is going to be easy money. I'm used to staying awake for one night, no problem. But then they realize we don't allow coffee. And once they realize that, it's too late for them, they're already in study, and it's much harder for them to stay awake. But we try to make it interesting for them, and by the time they get to the fMRI, it's very helpful. So before and after each session, we measure their anxiety in the evening and then in the morning, and then we also have them watch some emotional content while they're inside the functional MRI. So first, let's look at the results of the anxiety. What we saw is that after a night of sleep, participants reported some level of anxiety, but it was very similar to the one they had just before coming into the study. It's pretty much no change. However, after staying awake for one night, we saw an up to 30% increase in their level of anxiety. And if we just focus on the numbers that they gave us after a night of no sleep, half of them were actually hitting clinical levels of anxiety just by one night of no sleep. Next, we looked at the brain activity, what might be changing in the brain that could trigger these anxiogenic effects. And here we focused on two regions. The first is the amygdala, which is a nuclei deep in the brain, very active whenever something emotional or stressful happens to us. People have heard of the amygdala? So we have two of them, and well, typically I think evolutionary, in course of the evolution, they were mostly active for like snakes or bears. Now they're mostly active for emails or Twitter comments and things like that. But still, nevertheless, very important to alert us that something is threatening or risky. And people who don't have amygdala for different reasons, atrophy or calcification, they show no signs of fear. And that's just as maladaptive. So it is important to have that kind of alarm in our brains. So that's the amygdala. We were interested in that. And the second region we were interested in is the prefrontal cortex, which is right behind our eyebrows and our forehead. And you can think of it as the control center of the brain, very active in helping us make logical decisions, plan our day, and also in terms of emotion, very relevant in emotion regulation. So whenever we look at activity of the prefrontal cortex during an emotional experience, we see that it tends to dampen down or downregulate the activity of the amygdala. And that connectivity between these two regions, between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, is very relevant for stress regulation, for anxiety. So first, when we look at the activity of the amygdala, we saw that it was quite active after a night of sleep. This makes sense because we were showing them emotional content. But after a night of no sleep, it was significantly more active, up to 60% more active. And other studies have shown this as well, so this is quite a robust effect. The amygdala becomes more activated when we don't get enough sleep. But when we look at the prefrontal cortex, we actually see the opposite pattern. It's quite active through emotional content after a night of sleep, but almost completely shut down without sleep. And this profile of having more amygdala activity and less of the prefrontal activity is exactly what we see in people who have anxiety disorders or have high levels of anxiety. So in other words, sleep loss seems to target or mimic exactly the mechanisms that ruin our ability to use emotional regulation. So let's try and summarize these changes in sort of a modern day aspect that might be happening. Let's say we're getting this stressful email from our boss. We have a strong amygdala reaction. And if we're lucky and we had enough sleep, a few seconds later, we would get this activity from the prefrontal cortex down-regulating our amygdala. So this could be the equivalent of reading the email again and saying, you know what, this is not so bad, I can handle this. And then we just feel a bit better about the situation. However, if you don't have a night of sleep and you get that email, first of all, we are more reactive to it. Our amygdala would be much more reactive, and we would feel this or experience it as being more stressful. And there are studies showing that the tolerance to stress is actually lower in people who haven't slept. So first it is felt or experienced as more stressful, but then also to make things worse, the prefrontal cortex is not there to save us. So we don't have those intrinsic mechanisms of emotion regulation that make us feel a bit better about the situation. And then now when we reread the email, we just feel completely worse. So these are the things that we think are happening when we don't get enough sleep. We see this increase in reactivity. We're more reactive to stress and to emotional experiences. And on the other hand, we're less able to regulate. So in other words, you can think about lack of sleep and anxiety as targeting the same vulnerability. They're basically targeting the same regions in the brain, regions that ruin our ability to regulate emotions and make us more emotionally reactive. What happens when we do get a night of sleep? How does a night of sleep help block this experience from happening? So I'll remind you that we had 2 sessions for each participant, and in one of them, they were sleeping and they had their brain activity recorded. So we focused only on that session now, and we asked a simple question. If we look across a night of sleep, do we see that different stages or maybe brain activity during sleep can tell us how anxious someone would be the next day? A quick reminder of a sleep cycle. We have 4 main stages. We start off with drowsy sleep, when we are kind of not really sure if we fell asleep or not. If you wake up someone at that stage, they might not say they were sleeping. That's the classic, I was watching that, and as you turn off the TV, and someone's on the sofa. And then we go into light sleep. And light sleep, people usually feel that they're asleep if you wake them up, but it's still a bit easier to wake them up at that stage. And there are changes in brain activity that we can start seeing already here. After about 10-15 minutes of light sleep, we drift into deep sleep. And that's the part of sleep where it is the hardest to wake someone up from. We see that our heart rate is the lowest it will be in 24 hours. Our blood pressure, our breathing rate is really low. And if you wake someone up from deep sleep, they will be disoriented for a bit. They will be confused, and it'll take them a few minutes to understand where they are and what they're doing. After deep sleep, which is the beginning of the night, can be up to 40 minutes of that, the brain kind of wakes up again, and we go into REM sleep, the stage where most dreams occur. And then the cycle continues, and we will have about 5 or 6 of those, depending on how long we sleep. So we looked and quantified using the brain recordings that we had at all these stages, and we asked what from about these stages can tell us if someone would report feeling anxious or calm the next day. And what we found is that the time participants spent specifically in deep sleep, out of all these stages, was associated with feeling less anxious the next day. And it wasn't just the time. When we looked at the brain activity during deep sleep, what we typically see is these beautiful slow waves. very slow frequency waves that kind of cover the entire cortex when people go into deep sleep. And what we found is that people that had these nice, long, and very powerful waves were also the ones reporting feeling less anxious the next day. So the quality, but also the quantity of deep sleep, both were pointing at the same direction of having less anxiety. And it's interesting to know that people who have anxiety disorder, this is the stage of sleep where they have the most issues. They have the most awakenings during deep sleep. So again, we're seeing this connection where lack of sleep and anxiety are basically showing very similar biological mechanisms. So if we go back to our schematics here of the circle of horror, I like to call it, of the bad email, what we see is that after this amygdala activity, we are getting, hopefully, the help from the prefrontal cortex. And what we found is that the same signature of those slow waves that were predicting less anxiety were also predicting more activity in the prefrontal cortex the next day. So we can say that out of this cycle, the deep sleep part mostly helps us re-engage mechanisms that are relevant for emotion regulation. What does that tell us about the amygdala? Is there any part of sleep that might be related to how active the amygdala would be? So here I want to tell you about a study that was done in the Netherlands, not by us, asking very similar questions. They had 29 participants, pretty much the same age, and they had a functional MRI scan of the participants before and after sleep. They recorded sleep the same way we did. And what they did to trigger the amygdala, I think, is borderline unethical. They had participants listen to the voice of themselves in karaoke. Now, they didn't know they were recorded, so they didn't even make an effort, and it's really quite humiliating. So the first time they heard it in the scanner, I'll save you the demonstration. The first time they heard it, they had a very strong amygdala response, as you can imagine. But the authors, the scientists, noticed that in the morning they had a reduced amygdala response. They were a bit more relaxed about the situation. And they did the same analysis we did. What about the sleep cycle tells us that the amygdala is going to be calmer the next day? And here they found the importance of REM sleep. The more participants had REM sleep, but also the better quality REM sleep, so they didn't keep waking up during sleep, was also very relevant. The quality of REM sleep and the duration told them that the amygdala would be calmer the next day. So if we go back to our cycle, we can say that REM sleep helps us regulate our reactivity, how reactive we are to an emotional challenge, and deep sleep helps us re-engage emotion regulation. And together, this beautiful cycle of sleep helps us regain our ability to stay calm. So you may have heard suggestion to keep calm and go to sleep. I would say go to sleep, and that will keep you calm. Thank you very much, and I would love to take it up.